The grand hall of the palace shimmered with golden light as the setting sun filtered through the towering stained-glass windows. Lavish tapestries adorned the walls, depicting tales of past rulers and their great victories. But tonight, the focus was not on past glories. It was on the union that the queen herself had orchestrated. Servants scurried about, ensuring every corner of the hall was pristine, every candle precisely placed. The atmosphere was heavy, a mixture of tension and opulence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Prince Alaric stood at the edge of the room, his broad shoulders tense under the weight of his royal blue and gold ceremonial attire. His jaw tightened as he observed the bustling preparations, his mind a whirlwind of frustration and resignation. The queen, his mother, had made it abundantly clear, this marriage was not about love. It was about power, alliances, and securing the throne's future. Duty before desire, she had reminded him countless times, her voice firm and unyielding. "Your Highness," a steward interrupted his thoughts, bowing low. "The princess has arrived." Alaric exhaled sharply, his fists clenching at his sides. He turned, his piercing gaze meeting the steward's apprehensive eyes. "Very well," he muttered, his voice devoid of warmth. He strode toward the grand entrance, each step echoing through the cavernous hall. The weight of his mother's expectations pressed heavily on his chest, and he squared his shoulders, bracing himself for what lay ahead. The doors creaked open, revealing Princess Eloise. She was dressed in a pale pink gown that shimmered with every movement, the intricate lacework and jewels catching the light. Her cheeks were flushed, whether from the cold or nerves, and her wide hazel eyes darted nervously around the room. She was no conventional beauty, and she knew it. Her frame was larger than what society deemed acceptable, and the whispers that followed her arrival only served to deepen her insecurities. But she held her head high, determined to face whatever judgment awaited her. Alaric's gaze swept over her, his expression unreadable. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her skirts, the way she avoided meeting his eyes for too long. For a moment, a pang of guilt tugged at him. None of this was her fault. She, too, was a pawn in his mother's grand game. The queen's voice rang out, cutting through the silence. "Welcome, Princess Eloise. We are delighted to have you here." Her tone was cordial, but there was an undercurrent of calculation. She descended the staircase with regal grace, her crimson and ermine robes billowing behind her. "This union will bring great strength to both our kingdoms." Eloise curtsied deeply, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Your Majesty, it is an honor to be here." Alaric stepped forward, extending a hand toward her. "Princess," he said, his tone polite but distant. Eloise hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, yet she noticed the way his fingers twitched slightly, as if restraining himself from pulling away. The evening progressed with excruciating formality. A grand feast was held in the couple's honor, with tables laden with delicacies from across the kingdoms. Courtiers raised their goblets in toasts, their smiles thinly veiling their curiosity and judgment. Eloise felt their eyes on her, dissecting every move she made. She kept her composure, responding graciously to every comment, every veiled insult masked as a compliment. Alaric, meanwhile, barely spoke. He sat stiffly beside her, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. When their gazes met briefly, Eloise tried to offer a small smile, but he looked away, his expression hardening. The warmth she had hoped for was absent, replaced by a cold indifference that made her heart sink. Later that evening, Eloise found herself alone in the chambers prepared for her. The room was opulent, with rich tapestries and a massive four-poster bed draped in velvet. But it felt empty, devoid of any comfort or warmth. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she removed her gloves. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying would accomplish nothing. She had known this marriage would be a challenge, but the reality was harsher than she had anticipated. Meanwhile, Alaric stood on the palace balcony, the cold night air biting at his skin. He stared out at the city below, the lights twinkling like stars. His thoughts were a chaotic mess. He had always dreamed of marrying for love, of finding someone who would see him for who he truly was, beyond the title and the crown. And now, here he was, bound to a woman he barely knew, all for the sake of duty. He couldn't deny that Eloise had shown poise and grace despite the obvious challenges she faced. But he felt trapped, suffocated by the circumstances forced upon him. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Sacrifices must be made for the greater good. But at what cost? Days turned into weeks, and the awkwardness between Alaric and Eloise persisted. They went through the motions of their royal duties, appearing together at public events, smiling for the crowds. Behind closed doors, however, they remained distant, their conversations brief and formal. Eloise threw herself into her new role with determination. She spent hours in the library, studying the kingdom's history, politics, and culture. She attended council meetings, offering insights that surprised even the most seasoned advisors. Slowly, she began to earn their respect, though it did little to ease the loneliness that gnawed at her. One afternoon, as Eloise walked through the palace gardens, she stumbled upon a young servant tending to a wounded bird. The boy's hands trembled as he tried to splint the bird's wing. Eloise knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "May I help?" The boy hesitated before nodding. Together, they worked to care for the bird, Eloise's delicate touch and soothing words calming both the boy and the creature. Alaric, who had been watching from a distance, felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. He had never seen this side of her before, so kind, so tender. That evening, during dinner, Alaric broke their usual silence. "I heard about the bird," he said, his tone softer than usual. Eloise looked up, surprised. "The boy was grateful for your help." Eloise's cheeks flushed. "It was nothing," she replied modestly. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone would have," Alaric said quietly. For the first time, there was a flicker of warmth in his eyes, and Eloise felt a glimmer of hope. As the weeks passed, small moments like these began to bridge the gap between them. Alaric started to see beyond the surface, noticing the strength and kindness that defined Eloise. She, in turn, glimpsed the man behind the prince, a man burdened by duty, longing for freedom. Slowly but surely, the walls between them began to crumble. As the months went by, the cracks in their icy dynamic began to warm with a tentative closeness. It wasn't grand declarations or dramatic shifts, but rather a series of small, unexpected moments that turned the tide. One evening, as Eloise pored over documents in the study, Alaric wandered in, intending to retrieve a book. He paused in the doorway, watching her brow furrow as she scribbled notes. "You've been spending a lot of time here," he said, breaking the silence. Eloise looked up, startled but not displeased by his presence. "The advisors have been generous in sharing their knowledge. There's so much I still need to understand." "You've impressed them, you know," Alaric said, stepping further into the room. "Lord Harlan told me you've grasped trade negotiations better than most council members." A blush crept across Eloise's cheeks. "I only want to do my part," she replied. "If I am to be a queen, I must be worthy of the title." "You're more than worthy," Alaric said, his voice sincere. The words hung in the air between them, and Eloise's heart fluttered at the unexpected compliment. Moments like these became more frequent. Alaric began seeking her out, not for duty but for companionship. He found himself drawn to her intelligence, her wit, and her unwavering kindness. She, in turn, began to see the vulnerable man beneath the hardened exterior, a man who carried the weight of his kingdom with quiet strength. One evening, as they strolled through the palace gardens, Alaric shared a memory from his childhood. "When I was little, I used to climb the east wall to watch the sunrise. My mother forbade it, of course, but I didn't care. It was the only place I felt free." Eloise smiled softly. "I can't imagine you as a rebel." "Oh, I was quite the troublemaker," he admitted, a mischievous glint in his eye. "But those moments of freedom were rare. Even as a child, I knew what was expected of me." Eloise nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "It's a heavy burden, isn't it? To always be what others need you to be." For a moment, their eyes met, and Alaric felt a jolt of understanding. She knew. She truly understood the weight he carried, for she carried it too. Their bond deepened, and with it came an unspoken understanding. Alaric began to see the beauty in Eloise, not just in her kindness and intelligence but in her resilience, her courage to face a world that often judged her harshly. And Eloise, for the first time, allowed herself to hope that this union, born of duty, might become something more. But their newfound harmony was not without challenges. The queen, ever watchful, began to notice the change in her son. She saw the way his eyes softened when he looked at Eloise, the way he sought her opinion in council meetings. It unsettled her. This marriage had been a strategic move, nothing more. Love had no place in her plans. One evening, she summoned Alaric to her private chambers. "You've grown close to the princess," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "She is my wife," Alaric replied, his voice steady. The queen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do not let sentiment cloud your judgment. This union was forged for the good of the kingdom, not for your personal happiness." Alaric's jaw tightened. "And what if my happiness strengthens the kingdom? What if our partnership makes us stronger?" The queen's gaze hardened. "Love is a weakness, Alaric. Remember that." But Alaric was no longer the obedient son who had bowed to her every command. He had found something worth fighting for, and he would not let it slip away. As winter tightened its grip on the kingdom, snow blanketed the palace grounds, transforming the gardens into a wonderland of white. Eloise found solace in these serene moments, her steps crunching softly on the snow as she wandered the paths. Alaric had taken to joining her on these walks, their conversations ranging from light-hearted banter to discussions of royal affairs. One such afternoon, as the sun cast a golden glow over the icy expanse, Alaric approached Eloise with a rare smile. He carried 2 steaming mugs of mulled wine, the fragrant aroma of spices wafting in the cold air. "I thought you might appreciate this," he said, handing her a mug. Eloise accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "Thank you," she said, her smile genuine. "You're full of surprises lately, Your Highness." "Alaric," he corrected, his tone gentle. "I think we've known each other long enough for you to call me by my name." Eloise's cheeks flushed, and she nodded. "Alaric, then?" The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her heart skip. They walked in comfortable silence, the snow falling softly around them. As they reached a frozen fountain at the heart of the garden, Alaric turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to ask," he began, his voice hesitant. "Are you happy here?" Eloise blinked, caught off guard by the question. She hesitated before answering, her breath visible in the chilly air. "I've found purpose here," she said carefully. "And that's more than I could have hoped for." "But happiness?" Alaric pressed, his gaze searching hers. Eloise met his eyes, her own filled with a mix of vulnerability and resolve. "Happiness is complicated, but I'm learning to find it in small things. Like this moment." Alaric's heart stirred at her words. He had spent so long burying his emotions, focusing solely on duty, that he had forgotten the beauty of small joys. "You deserve more than small moments," he said quietly. "You deserve a life full of them." The sincerity in his voice caught Eloise off guard, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of more. But the shadow of the queen's expectations loomed large, and she quickly pushed the thought aside. Back in the palace, tensions were beginning to rise. The queen's distrust of Eloise was growing, fueled by the reports of courtiers who resented the princess's increasing influence. Though Eloise had won over many with her intelligence and kindness, there were those who saw her as an outsider, unworthy of the crown. The queen summoned her trusted advisor, Lord Marcellus, to discuss her concerns. "The girl is becoming too comfortable," she said, pacing the length of her chambers. "Alaric's affections are clouding his judgment." Lord Marcellus inclined his head. "What would you have me do, Your Majesty?" The queen paused, her gaze steely. "We must remind her of her place. Subtly, of course. Let her know that while she may wear the crown, the true power lies elsewhere." Marcellus nodded, a sly smile curling his lips. "Consider it done." The queen's machinations soon began to manifest in subtle but calculated ways. Eloise found herself excluded from key meetings, her suggestions dismissed under the guise of tradition. Whispered rumors spread through the court, questioning her competence and loyalty. At first, Eloise tried to rise above it, focusing on her duties and the support she had earned. But the weight of the whispers began to take its toll, and Alaric noticed the change in her. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as they sat before the fireplace in their chambers. "What's troubling you?" As the months went by, the cracks in their icy dynamic began to warm with a tentative closeness. It wasn't grand declarations or dramatic shifts, but rather a series of small, unexpected moments that turned the tide. One evening, as Eloise pored over documents in the study, Alaric wandered in, intending to retrieve a book. He paused in the doorway, watching her brow furrow as she scribbled notes. "You've been spending a lot of time here," he said, breaking the silence. Eloise looked up, startled but not displeased by his presence. "The advisors have been generous in sharing their knowledge. There's so much I still need to understand." "You've impressed them, you know," Alaric said, stepping further into the room. "Lord Harlan told me you've grasped trade negotiations better than most council members." A blush crept across Eloise's cheeks. "I only want to do my part," she replied. "If I am to be a queen, I must be worthy of the title." "You're more than worthy," Alaric said, his voice sincere. The words hung in the air between them, and Eloise's heart fluttered at the unexpected compliment. Moments like these became more frequent. Alaric began seeking her out, not for duty but for companionship. He found himself drawn to her intelligence, her wit, and her unwavering kindness. She, in turn, began to see the vulnerable man beneath the hardened exterior, a man who carried the weight of his kingdom with quiet strength. One evening, as they strolled through the palace gardens, Alaric shared a memory from his childhood. "When I was little, I used to climb the east wall to watch the sunrise. My mother forbade it, of course, but I didn't care. It was the only place I felt free." Eloise smiled softly. "I can't imagine you as a rebel." "Oh, I was quite the troublemaker," he admitted, a mischievous glint in his eye. "But those moments of freedom were rare. Even as a child, I knew what was expected of me." Eloise nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "It's a heavy burden, isn't it? To always be what others need you to be." For a moment, their eyes met, and Alaric felt a jolt of understanding. She knew. She truly understood the weight he carried, for she carried it too. Their bond deepened, and with it came an unspoken understanding. Alaric began to see the beauty in Eloise, not just in her kindness and intelligence but in her resilience, her courage to face a world that often judged her harshly. And Eloise, for the first time, allowed herself to hope that this union, born of duty, might become something more. But their newfound harmony was not without challenges. The queen, ever watchful, began to notice the change in her son. She saw the way his eyes softened when he looked at Eloise, the way he sought her opinion in council meetings. It unsettled her. This marriage had been a strategic move, nothing more. Love had no place in her plans. One evening, she summoned Alaric to her private chambers. "You've grown close to the princess," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "She is my wife," Alaric replied, his voice steady. The queen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do not let sentiment cloud your judgment. This union was forged for the good of the kingdom, not for your personal happiness." Alaric's jaw tightened. "And what if my happiness strengthens the kingdom? What if our partnership makes us stronger?" The queen's gaze hardened. "Love is a weakness, Alaric. Remember that." But Alaric was no longer the obedient son who had bowed to her every command. He had found something worth fighting for, and he would not let it slip away. As winter tightened its grip on the kingdom, snow blanketed the palace grounds, transforming the gardens into a wonderland of white. Eloise found solace in these serene moments, her steps crunching softly on the snow as she wandered the paths. Alaric had taken to joining her on these walks, their conversations ranging from light-hearted banter to discussions of royal affairs. One such afternoon, as the sun cast a golden glow over the icy expanse, Alaric approached Eloise with a rare smile. He carried 2 steaming mugs of mulled wine, the fragrant aroma of spices wafting in the cold air. "I thought you might appreciate this," he said, handing her a mug. Eloise accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "Thank you," she said, her smile genuine. "You're full of surprises lately, Your Highness." "Alaric," he corrected, his tone gentle. "I think we've known each other long enough for you to call me by my name." Eloise's cheeks flushed, and she nodded. "Alaric, then?" The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her heart skip. They walked in comfortable silence, the snow falling softly around them. As they reached a frozen fountain at the heart of the garden, Alaric turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to ask," he began, his voice hesitant. "Are you happy here?" Eloise blinked, caught off guard by the question. She hesitated before answering, her breath visible in the chilly air. "I've found purpose here," she said carefully. "And that's more than I could have hoped for." "But happiness?" Alaric pressed, his gaze searching hers. Eloise met his eyes, her own filled with a mix of vulnerability and resolve. "Happiness is complicated, but I'm learning to find it in small things." Like this moment, Alaric's heart stirred at her words. He had spent so long burying his emotions, focusing solely on duty, that he had forgotten the beauty of small joys. "You deserve more than small moments," he said quietly. "You deserve a life full of them." The sincerity in his voice caught Eloise off guard, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of more. But the shadow of the Queen's expectations loomed large, and she quickly pushed the thought aside. Back in the palace, tensions were beginning to rise. The Queen's distrust of Eloise was growing, fueled by the reports of courtiers who resented the princess's increasing influence. Though Eloise had won over many with her intelligence and kindness, there were those who saw her as an outsider, unworthy of the crown. The Queen summoned her trusted advisor, Lord Marcellus, to discuss her concerns. "The girl is becoming too comfortable," she said, pacing the length of her chambers. "Alaric's affections are clouding his judgment." Lord Marcellus inclined his head. "What would you have me do, Your Majesty?" The Queen paused, her gaze steely. "We must remind her of her place. Subtly, of course. Let her know that while she may wear the crown, the true power lies elsewhere." Marcellus nodded, a sly smile curling his lips. "Consider it done." The Queen's machinations soon began to manifest in subtle but calculated ways. Eloise found herself excluded from key meetings, her suggestions dismissed under the guise of tradition. Whispered rumors spread through the court, questioning her competence and loyalty. At first, Eloise tried to rise above it, focusing on her duties and the support she had earned. But the weight of the whispers began to take its toll, and Alaric noticed the change in her. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as they sat before the fireplace in their chambers. "What's troubling you?" Eloise hesitated, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "It's nothing," she said, her voice lacking conviction. Alaric frowned. "Don't lie to me, Eloise. I see it in your eyes. You're carrying something heavy." Her resolve crumbled under his concerned gaze. "The court doesn't want me here," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what I do, it's never enough." Alaric's jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Who's been saying this? Is it my mother?" Eloise shook her head. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is that I won't let them win. I've faced worse than this." Alaric reached for her hand, his grip firm yet reassuring. "You're not alone in this," he said. "I won't let them tear you down." His words were a balm to her wounded spirit, and for the first time in weeks, Eloise allowed herself to lean on him. Together, they began to strategize, working as a team to counter the Queen's subtle manipulations. The turning point came during a grand banquet, attended by nobles from across the realm. Eloise had spent days preparing, determined to prove her worth. As the evening unfolded, she skillfully navigated conversations, charming even the most skeptical lords and ladies. When a particularly influential duke challenged her knowledge of trade policies, Eloise responded with such eloquence and insight that the room fell silent in admiration. Alaric, watching from the head of the table, felt a surge of pride. By the end of the night, even the Queen could not deny Eloise's growing influence. But instead of feeling defeated, she saw an opportunity. If Eloise could be controlled, her strengths could serve the crown. It was a dangerous game, and the Queen was determined to play it. The following weeks marked a subtle but significant shift in the dynamics of the palace. Eloise, armed with Alaric's support, threw herself deeper into her role as princess. She sought out opportunities to engage with the common people, attending public gatherings, visiting orphanages, and lending an ear to those who had long felt ignored by the crown. Her genuine compassion won the hearts of the citizens, and soon whispers of Eloise the Benevolent began circulating in the streets. Alaric often accompanied her on these outings, though initially skeptical. However, as he witnessed the way children's faces lit up when Eloise knelt to speak with them or how laborers bowed deeply, their gratitude genuine, he began to see the immense value she brought to the kingdom, not just politically, but emotionally. One afternoon, during a visit to a local village recovering from a devastating fire, Eloise noticed a young girl clutching a singed doll. The child's tear-streaked face tugged at her heart. Without hesitation, Eloise knelt, speaking softly to the girl as she carefully repaired the doll using scraps of fabric offered by the villagers. As Alaric watched Eloise work, a strange warmth filled his chest. She was more than he had ever expected, more than he deserved. It was in that moment, surrounded by the grateful villagers, that he realized how much he had underestimated her. Later that evening, as they returned to the palace, Alaric broke the comfortable silence in the carriage. "You were incredible today," he said, his voice uncharacteristically tender. Eloise looked up from her lap, her expression uncertain. "I only did what anyone with a heart would do." "No," Alaric insisted, his tone firm. "What you did was far more than that. You gave those people hope. You gave them something to hold on to." Her cheeks flushed at his praise, and she quickly turned her gaze to the window, hiding the smile that tugged at her lips. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, the queen was plotting her next move. Though she begrudgingly acknowledged Eloise's growing popularity, she still saw the princess as a threat to her influence over Alaric. She summoned Lord Marcellus once again, her eyes cold and calculating. "She's gaining too much favor," the queen said, her voice laced with irritation. "If this continues, she'll overshadow me entirely." Marcellus raised an eyebrow, his mind already working through possibilities. "Perhaps it's time to turn the prince against her," he suggested. The queen considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. Plant seeds of doubt. If Alaric begins to question her loyalty or her motives, their bond will fracture." Unaware of the schemes brewing around them, Alaric and Eloise continued to grow closer. Their once stilted conversations now flowed with ease, filled with shared laughter and stolen glances. Alaric found himself drawn to her sharp wit and unshakable resolve, while Eloise discovered a softer, more vulnerable side to the prince that few ever saw. One evening, as they strolled through the palace gardens under a canopy of stars, Alaric hesitated before speaking. "Eloise," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I know this marriage wasn't what either of us wanted. But I'm starting to think, maybe it's exactly what we needed." Eloise's steps faltered, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to face him, searching his eyes for any hint of insincerity. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I see you," Alaric said, his voice thick with emotion. "I see your strength, your kindness, your heart. And I'm grateful every day that you're by my side." Eloise's breath caught, and for a moment, she allowed herself to hope. "Alaric," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before she could finish, a servant approached, bowing low. "Your Highnesses, the Queen requests your presence in the throne room." The moment shattered, and the couple exchanged a glance before reluctantly following the servant. In the throne room, the Queen awaited them with a carefully crafted expression of concern. "Alaric, Eloise," she began, her tone heavy with feigned gravity, "there is a matter of great importance that has come to my attention." She gestured for Marcellus, who stepped forward with a stack of papers. "It seems," the Queen continued, "that there have been discrepancies in the accounts of the royal treasury. Funds allocated to certain projects are unaccounted for." Eloise frowned, confused. "What projects?" Marcellus smirked subtly, handing her the papers. "The initiatives you proposed, Your Highness. The funds were redirected to your projects, but they seem to have disappeared." Eloise's heart sank as she scanned the documents, her mind racing. She knew she had been meticulous in her oversight of the projects, ensuring every coin was accounted for. "This must be a mistake," she said firmly, looking up at the Queen. "I assure you, I have done nothing improper." The Queen's expression hardened. "Mistake or not, this casts a shadow on your judgment, Eloise. We cannot afford such carelessness." Alaric stepped forward, his voice steady and resolute. "Mother, you know as well as I do that Eloise would never do such a thing. This is clearly an attempt to undermine her." The Queen feigned surprise. "Undermine her? Why would anyone do such a thing? She has been given every opportunity to succeed." The tension in the room was palpable, and Eloise felt her throat tighten. She glanced at Alaric, silently pleading for him to believe her. "I will investigate this personally," Alaric said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Until then, I suggest we withhold judgment." The Queen's lips thinned, but she nodded. "Very well. But tread carefully, Alaric. The kingdom's trust is at stake." That night, Eloise sat alone in her chambers, the weight of the accusation pressing down on her. She felt as though the walls were closing in, the whispers of doubt growing louder with every passing moment. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts, and she looked up to see Alaric enter. His expression was a mixture of frustration and determination. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "This is my mother's doing." "I know it." Eloise managed a weak smile. "Thank you for standing up for me. It means more than you know." Alaric crossed the room, sitting beside her. "I'll get to the bottom of this," he promised. "We'll prove your innocence." Eloise nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I trust you," she whispered. For the first time, Alaric reached for her hand, his grip reassuring. "We'll get through this together." The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension and investigation. Alaric worked tirelessly, poring over records and questioning those involved in the projects. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, one that pointed directly to Marcellus. Confronting the advisor in private, Alaric's voice was icy. "You've been embezzling funds and framing my wife. Admit it?" Marcellus smirked, unrepentant. "And what if I have? Do you think your mother will side with you over me? I've been her loyal servant for decades." Alaric's eyes narrowed. "This isn't just about loyalty. It's about justice. And I won't let you destroy Eloise to protect yourself." With that, Alaric ordered Marcellus's arrest, presenting the evidence to the Queen. She could no longer deny her advisor's betrayal, though her expression remained unreadable. Eloise was cleared of all suspicion, her reputation restored. The court watched in stunned silence as Alaric publicly declared his unwavering support for his wife, his words a clear message to anyone who dared to challenge her again. As the snow began to melt and spring approached, the bond between Alaric and Eloise deepened. Their shared trials had forged a connection neither of them had anticipated, and they found themselves drawn to each other in ways that transcended duty or expectation. One evening, as they stood on the palace balcony watching the first hints of green return to the landscape, Alaric turned to Eloise, his eyes filled with emotion. "I've spent so long resenting this marriage," he admitted. "But now, I can't imagine my life without you." Eloise's breath hitched, and she looked at him with equal parts surprise and hope. "Alaric." He took her hands in his voice steady and sincere. "I love you, Eloise. Not because I have to, but because you've shown me what love truly means." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she smiled, her heart swelling with a happiness she had never thought possible. "I love you too," she whispered. In that moment, under the starlit sky, they sealed their love with a kiss, a promise of a future built not on duty, but on the strength of their hearts. The bond between Eloise and Alaric blossomed like the kingdom's meadows in spring. Their newfound love was not just an emotional awakening but a strategic advantage as well. Together, they became a force to be reckoned with, a united front that even the Queen could not easily undermine. However, the Queen's schemes did not end with Marcellus's arrest. She remained resolute, convinced that Eloise's growing influence posed a threat to the old order she had worked so hard to preserve. One day, as Eloise reviewed plans for a new educational initiative to benefit the kingdom's poorest villages, a knock at the door disrupted her thoughts. It was Lady Rosalind, one of the Queen's closest confidants. Though Rosalind's presence often meant trouble, Eloise greeted her with her characteristic poise. "Lady Rosalind," Eloise said, motioning for her to sit. "What brings you here today?" Rosalind's lips curled into a practiced smile, but her eyes were sharp. "Your Highness, I simply wish to offer some advice. You've been working so tirelessly, and while your efforts are admirable, I fear you may be overstepping certain boundaries." Eloise's brow furrowed. "Boundaries? I'm only fulfilling my duties as princess." "Of course," Rosalind replied smoothly. "But you must understand, some within the court view your actions as overly ambitious. They might question whether your motives are entirely selfless." Eloise's jaw tightened. She knew this was yet another attempt to sow doubt, but she refused to let it rattle her. "My only motive is to serve the people of this kingdom. If that is seen as ambition, so be it." Rosalind's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Very well, Your Highness. I hope you'll keep my words in mind." With that, she rose and left, her skirts rustling as she disappeared down the corridor. Eloise sat in silence for a moment, her resolve hardening. She would not let whispers and veiled threats deter her. If anything, they only fueled her determination to prove her worth, not just as Alaric's wife, but as a leader in her own right. As the weeks passed, Eloise's initiatives began to bear fruit. New schools were built, roads were repaired, and access to clean water improved in areas that had long been neglected. The people's gratitude was palpable, and their loyalty to the crown grew stronger with each passing day. Alaric, too, was thriving. Inspired by Eloise's passion, he took a more active role in governance, working closely with her to address the kingdom's most pressing issues. Their partnership did not go unnoticed. At court, nobles who had once dismissed Eloise as a mere pawn began to recognize her as a formidable presence. Even the Queen, despite her lingering resentment, could not deny the positive impact Eloise was having on the kingdom. But not everyone was pleased with the changes. A faction of nobles, led by the Duke of Weatherstone, began to voice their dissent. They saw Eloise's reforms as a threat to their power and wealth, and they were determined to put an end to her influence. One evening, as Alaric and Eloise shared a quiet dinner in their private quarters, a messenger arrived bearing urgent news. The Duke of Weatherstone had called a secret meeting of several high-ranking nobles, and rumors of a plot against the royal couple were already spreading. "This is no coincidence," Alaric said, his expression dark. "They're afraid of what we're building. They want to keep the kingdom stuck in the past, where they can hoard their wealth and power without accountability." Eloise placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Then we must be smarter than them. We've faced challenges before, and we've overcome them together. This will be no different." Alaric nodded, his resolve firm. "We'll need allies, people we can trust to stand with us." Over the next several days, Alaric and Eloise worked tirelessly to strengthen their position. They reached out to loyal nobles, commanders in the royal army, and influential figures among the common people. Slowly but surely, they built a coalition of supporters who shared their vision for a fairer, stronger kingdom. The tipping point came during a grand banquet held in honor of the kingdom's founding anniversary. The Queen, ever the consummate hostess, presided over the event with her usual grace, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Eloise and Alaric entered the hall together, their heads held high, exuding an air of confidence that belied the uncertainty of the evening. As the banquet progressed, the Duke of Weatherstone rose to address the assembly. His voice was smooth, but his words carried a sharp edge. "While we celebrate the glory of our kingdom tonight, we must also consider its future. Change is inevitable, but not all change is beneficial. We must be cautious, lest we lose sight of what has made our kingdom strong for generations." The hall fell silent, all eyes turning to Alaric and Eloise. The Duke's challenge was clear, and the room held its breath, waiting for their response. Alaric stood, his expression calm but commanding. "The strength of our kingdom lies not in clinging to the past, but in embracing progress. My wife and I have worked tirelessly to improve the lives of our people, and we will not apologize for seeking a brighter future for all." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement while others exchanged wary glances. The Duke's lips curled into a thin smile. "And yet, Your Highness, some might argue that your so-called progress comes at a great cost. The traditions that bind us, the stability that has sustained us, are these to be discarded so easily?" Eloise rose then, her voice steady and filled with quiet strength. "Tradition and progress are not mutually exclusive, Your Grace. True strength comes from adapting to the needs of the present while honoring the lessons of the past. The people of this kingdom deserve leaders who will fight for their well-being, not for their own interests." The Duke's face darkened, but before he could respond, the Queen interjected. "Enough." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is neither the time nor the place for such discussions." Though the Queen's intervention ended the immediate confrontation, the lines had been drawn. The banquet continued, but the atmosphere remained charged. Alaric and Eloise left the hall that night knowing that the battle for the kingdom's future was far from over. The following weeks were marked by a flurry of political maneuvering. The Duke and his allies worked tirelessly to undermine Alaric and Eloise, spreading rumors and sowing discord among the nobility. But the royal couple refused to back down. They continued their reforms, their resolve strengthened by the support of the people and their growing love for each other. One night, as they sat by the fire in their chambers, Alaric turned to Eloise with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it? All this fighting, all these challenges?" Eloise met his gaze, her eyes shining with determination. "It's worth it because it's right. We're not just fighting for ourselves, Alaric. We're fighting for a better future, for everyone." Alaric smiled, his heart swelling with pride and love. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," he said softly. "You stood by me," Eloise replied, her voice equally soft. "That's all I ever needed." Their love, forged in the fires of adversity, became the foundation of their strength. Together, they faced every challenge that came their way, determined to build a kingdom that would stand as a beacon of hope and justice for generations to come. As winter's chill gripped the kingdom, the conflict between Alaric and Eloise's vision for progress and the Duke of Weatherstone's desire to preserve the old order escalated into open confrontation. The royal couple's reforms had won the hearts of many, but the Duke's faction was equally determined to halt their progress. The court became a battlefield of whispers and alliances, every gesture laden with hidden meaning. It was during this turbulent time that Eloise began visiting the outskirts of the capital more frequently. The towns and villages there bore the brunt of inequality, and Eloise's presence among the people became a symbol of hope. She listened to their concerns, shared in their struggles, and promised them a brighter future. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. One frosty morning, Eloise stood in a crowded marketplace, speaking with a group of merchants about the rising cost of supplies. Her breath fogged in the cold air, but her voice was warm and clear. As she reassured them of upcoming trade reforms to ease their burdens, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the Duke of Weatherstone. "Princess Eloise," he said, his tone oily and polite. "I must commend your dedication to the people. It is admirable." Eloise turned to face him, her expression calm but guarded. "Your Grace, what brings you here?" The Duke smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Merely an interest in seeing the fruits of your labor. You've certainly captured the hearts of the common folk." "And yet, you remain skeptical," Eloise replied, her voice steady. "Tell me, Your Grace, do you not wish for a stronger, more united kingdom?" "Of course," the Duke said smoothly. "But strength requires order, and order requires discipline. Change, when pursued too recklessly, can lead to chaos." Eloise held his gaze, unflinching. Change is necessary when the old order fails to serve its people. Stability built on inequality is no stability at all. The Duke's smile faltered, and his eyes hardened. "A bold statement, Your Highness. But boldness can be a dangerous thing." With that, he inclined his head and departed, leaving Eloise with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She returned to the palace with renewed determination, knowing the Duke's veiled threats were a sign that their progress was making him desperate. The weeks that followed were tense. The Duke's faction grew bolder, their schemes more aggressive. One evening, a trusted advisor informed Alaric of a plot to discredit Eloise by accusing her of embezzling funds from the royal treasury. They've even forged documents, the advisor warned. If these accusations gain traction, it could ruin everything you've worked for. Alaric's fist slammed down on the table. This has gone too far. They won't stop until they destroy us. Eloise placed a calming hand on his arm. Then we must act first. Let them make their accusations, we'll be ready to counter them with the truth. But more than that, we need to expose their lies for what they are. Together, they devised a plan to turn the tables on the Duke. They gathered evidence of his corruption, tracing his financial dealings and uncovering a web of bribery and exploitation. It was a risky move, but one they knew was necessary to protect their vision for the kingdom. The decisive moment came during a council meeting, where the Duke presented his accusations against Eloise with a dramatic flourish. He produced the forged documents, his voice dripping with feigned concern. It pains me to say this, but it seems the princess has not been entirely honest in her dealings. Gasps rippled through the room, and Eloise stood, her expression calm but resolute. Your Grace, she said, her voice steady, it is you who have not been honest. She produced the evidence they had gathered, presenting it to the council. These documents expose a pattern of corruption that stretches back years. They show how the Duke has used his position to enrich himself at the expense of the people. The room erupted in murmurs, and the Duke's face turned ashen. He tried to protest, but the evidence was damning. One by one, the nobles began to distance themselves from him, unwilling to be associated with his treachery. The Queen, who had been watching silently, finally spoke. Enough, she said, her voice cold. The Duke of Weatherstone will be stripped of his title and placed under arrest. Let this serve as a reminder that no one is above the law. Though her words were firm, Eloise sensed the Queen's unease. This victory was a turning point, but it also signaled the end of the Queen's uncontested authority. The balance of power in the court had shifted, and Eloise and Alaric were now at its center. With the Duke's downfall, the royal couple's position was stronger than ever. Their reforms continued, and the kingdom began to transform in ways that had once seemed impossible. Roads and bridges connected distant regions, trade flourished, and education became a priority. The people, inspired by Eloise's unwavering dedication, rallied behind her and Alaric. But even as they celebrated their victories, new challenges loomed on the horizon. The Queen, though increasingly isolated, was not yet ready to concede defeat. She summoned Alaric to her private chambers, her tone unusually conciliatory. My son, she began, I see now that I may have underestimated Eloise. She has proven herself capable, and I cannot deny the positive changes you've brought to the kingdom. But I must ask, are you prepared for the sacrifices that will come with this path? Alaric met her gaze, his expression resolute. We've already made sacrifices, Mother. And will continue to do so if it means building a better future? The Queen sighed, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. Very well. But remember, the crown is a heavy burden. Do not let it consume you. As Alaric left her chambers, he felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that she seemed willing to step back, but also a lingering unease. The Queen was not one to surrender easily, and he couldn't shake the feeling that her words carried a hidden warning. Eloise, too, was preparing for what lay ahead. One evening, she visited the palace library, seeking solace among the shelves of ancient texts. She was surprised to find the Queen there, paging through an old tome. Your Majesty, Eloise said, bowing slightly. I didn't expect to find you here. The Queen looked up, her expression unreadable. Eloise, I suppose I could say the same of you. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. Finally, the Queen spoke. You've accomplished much in a short time. More than I ever thought possible. Thank you, Eloise replied cautiously. But there's still much to be done. The Queen closed the book, her gaze piercing. Be careful, Eloise. Power is a double-edged sword. It can uplift, but it can also destroy. Do not let your ambition blind you to the cost. Eloise met her gaze, her resolve unwavering. I will do whatever it takes to serve this kingdom and its people. That is my only ambition. The Queen studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then I hope, for all our sakes, that you succeed. As Eloise left the library, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Queen's words were both a warning and a challenge. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to face it head-on, with Alaric by her side. The kingdom blossomed under the changes Alaric and Eloise had brought. The people, once divided by class and privilege, began to come together under a shared vision of prosperity. Roads thrummed with trade, schools brimmed with eager children, and the once-forgotten villages at the kingdom's edges found their voices in the royal court. But not all shadows had dissipated. The Queen had retreated from public life, her influence waning, though her presence still lingered like a distant storm cloud. And while the Duke of Weatherstone's arrest had struck a blow to the old order, not everyone in the court embraced the new one. Small conspiracies brewed in secret corners, their whispers carried on the winter wind. Eloise and Alaric, however, pressed forward. Their bond had grown into something neither had expected. What had begun as a marriage of obligation had transformed into a partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and, finally, love. Their moments together, once stilted and perfunctory, now felt like the eye of a storm, calm, steady, and unshakable. One evening, after a particularly long day of council meetings, Eloise wandered into the royal gardens. The air was cool, the moonlight casting a silver glow over the snow-dusted trees. Alaric found her sitting on a stone bench, staring at the stars. "You're quiet tonight," he said, taking a seat beside her. She smiled faintly. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, and how much further there is to go." Alaric reached for her hand, his touch warm against the cold. "We'll face it together. Whatever comes." Eloise turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been, if we hadn't been forced into this?" Alaric finished for her, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "All the time. But I don't regret it. Not anymore." Her heart swelled at his words, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, their breaths mingling in the crisp night air. Their peace, however, was soon tested. One morning, a messenger arrived bearing dire news. Remnants of the Duke of Weatherstone's loyalists had gathered in the northern provinces, inciting rebellion. Though small in number, they had taken control of a key trade route, disrupting the kingdom's fragile economy. The council convened immediately. Some advisors urged swift military action, while others called for negotiation. Eloise listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "We cannot let this rebellion fester," one noble argued. "It's a direct challenge to the crown. And yet, meeting violence with violence could plunge us into a prolonged conflict," another countered. "We've worked so hard to rebuild trust among the people. Do we want to jeopardize that now?" Eloise raised her hand, silencing the room. "Both points are valid," she said. "But we need a solution that addresses the root cause. These rebels are clinging to a past that no longer serves the kingdom. If we can show them that the future we're building is one they can be part of, we might be able to sway them without bloodshed." Alaric nodded in agreement. "I'll lead a delegation to the north. If they're willing to talk, we'll find common ground. But if they refuse, we'll be ready." Eloise's heart clenched at the thought of him venturing into danger, but she knew it was the right decision. "Be careful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will," he promised, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And I'll come back to you. Always." The journey to the north was fraught with peril. Alaric and his delegation faced harsh weather, treacherous terrain, and the ever-present threat of ambush. When they finally reached the rebels' stronghold, they were met with hostility. The rebel leader, a grizzled former soldier named Garrick, eyed Alaric with open disdain. "You've come to crush us, I suppose," Garrick said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or perhaps to offer us empty promises?" "I've come to listen," Alaric replied evenly. "And to find a way forward that doesn't end in more suffering." Garrick's skepticism was palpable, but as Alaric spoke of the kingdom's transformation, of the bridges being built and the lives being changed, something in the rebel leader's demeanor shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the glimmer of possibility. Over the next few days, Alaric worked tirelessly to negotiate a truce. He listened to the rebels' grievances, acknowledged their pain, and outlined a plan to integrate them into the new order. By the time he departed, Garrick had agreed to lay down arms, provided the crown kept its word. When Alaric returned to the capital, the people greeted him as a hero. But for Eloise, his safe return was worth more than any accolades. She met him at the palace gates, her heart pounding with relief as he dismounted his horse. "You did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it," he corrected, pulling her into an embrace. "None of this would have been possible without you." The queen, watching from a window above, observed the scene with a mixture of pride and melancholy. She had underestimated them, both of them. Alaric's strength, Eloise's resolve, and the bond they had forged despite the odds. For the first time, she began to see that perhaps the future she had resisted was not so bleak after all. Years passed, and the kingdom flourished. Alaric and Eloise became beloved figures, their reign marked by unity and progress. The scars of the past were not forgotten, but they served as reminders of what could be overcome. Eloise gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Lyanna. The celebration that followed was unlike any the kingdom had seen, a testament to the hope and joy that now defined their rule. Lyanna grew up surrounded by love, her parents teaching her the values of compassion, strength, and duty. On the day of her coronation as crown princess, Eloise stood beside Alaric, their hands intertwined. She looked out at the crowd, nobles and commoners alike, and felt a surge of pride. They had built something enduring, something worth fighting for. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd erupted into cheers, Alaric leaned close to Eloise, his voice low and full of warmth. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" She smiled, her eyes glistening. "We have, and we're just getting started." Together, they turned to face the future, ready to embrace whatever it held. For they had proven, time and again, that love, courage, and a shared vision could conquer even the greatest of challenges.